Good afternoon, all. I am Tapas, Associate Fellow at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. On behalf of the Foundation, let me welcome you all to this Young Scholar online seminar series. FAS is not for a profit research organization based in India and established in 2003. Its major objective is to facilitate a multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical inquiry in the field of agrarian studies in India and elsewhere in less developed countries. We do so in association with a wide section of people interested in the research agrarian question, including person association with academic institution, member of mass organization working in the countryside, and other professionals and scholars. Since 2005, a major activity of the foundation has been an India-wide program of village studies titled the Project on Agrarian Relations in India. The program involves description and analysis and the creation of a detailed database on village India in diverse agricultural and socio-economic regions of the country. Till now, 27 villages covering a wide range of different climatic regions across 12 states of India have been surveyed as a part of the program. Drawing on this unique data archive and following follow-up studies, the Foundation has attempted to take up key research questions of the rural economy, including the situation of the household, the socioeconomic characteristic of small farmer, issues in women employment. The findings of these studies are regularly published as a part of socioeconomic survey series and an agrarian study series. FS also published a peer-reviewed journal of international deputy review of agrarian studies. It is an open source journal, and I argue all of you to visit the journal at www.rs.org.in. It would not be wrong to say this. It is a critical resource for academics interested in rural societies, economies, and histories. We have a long history of working with the young scholar, as Susan said, through different platforms. Whenever feasible, we have supported the researcher of MPhil and PhD scholar who are interested in the field of agrarian studies and different socioeconomic aspects of rural life in India. We invite students, doctorals, and postdoctoral researchers to come and work on a large database based on the primary data on rural India. Make use of our method and our database and other resources. We have a library focusing on agrarian studies located in Thrissur, Kerala, with a collection of more than 10,000 books and reports, and would be happy to see young researchers visit and work there. In the pre-COVID era, we used to conduct young scholar workshop with the aim of interacting with researchers, discussing the method of village studies and different dimensions of agrarian questions. This was also a platform for such scholars to discuss their research ideas with senior scholars and experts in the field. This seminar series is in a sense of an attempt to revive the institution that come to pause during the COVID-19 pandemic, although in an online mode. And we are very fortunate to have with us a set of 10 scholars who have either recently completed their doctoral studies and are in advanced stage, who will be presenting their work through the platform of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. Their work broadly covers areas of agricultural production, agrarian and labor relations, rural economy, caste in rural India, development of science and technology in agriculture. This seminar will be held once and every month, in all probability on the last Thursdays of every month. We are most fortunate to have Professor Barbara Harris White, Emeritus Professor of the Development Studies at the University of Oxford, as the series chair. Professor Barbara is someone who does not need any introduction in this crowd of the student and the scholar working on rural political economy, and particularly the political economy of rural India and South Asia. Let me also introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Srishti Yadav, who has recently finished her PhD from the New School for Social Research, New York. She is now instructor at Department of Economics, University of Manitoba, Canada. Dr. Paramjit Singh, Assistant Professor at the Department of Economics, Panjab University, will be the discussant for this seminar. With this introduction, may I call the chair, Professor Barbara, to initiate and moderate the proceeding. And in the interest of time, it is suggested that you in the audience kindly key your comments and questions in the Zoom Q&A box. They will be taken up in the interactive session that will follow the presentation. Professor Barbara.
Thank you, Tapas. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you to all the Foundation for Agrarian Studies team for all the organization behind the scenes. I just came back from the Max Planck Institute in Halle in Germany, where we were discussing political economy, socioeconomics, and economic anthropology, which is generally regarded as first low status and secondly in a state of crisis. And I came back thinking how grateful we are to the Foundation for keeping this candle burning very, very brightly and holding a forum, as Tapas said, for all kinds of resources to do with agrarian political economy. I'm not going to say anything more about our speakers, except that I think that Srishti is on her way to Azimpremji from Manitoba and is somewhere in the Delhi region due to the delights of Zoom, and that it's really up to Srishti how much of the next hour we listen to her or we discuss her findings. So without more ado, thank you very much. Over to you, Srishti, to talk about caste diversification and the implications for the agrarian question.
Thank you so very much, Professor Harris-White. Let me just share my screen and then get started. So is this visible?
Yes. Yes, it's visible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again to Professor Harris-White and to FAS, particularly Tapas and Sujan, for organizing all of this. I'm extremely grateful and also quite nervous, I have to say, to be presenting this work in front of sort of scholars whose work I am building on or whose works I have relied on quite heavily while doing this research project. My paper is titled Caste Diversification and the Contemporary Agrarian Question in India. Very briefly, what I intend to do in this presentation is briefly describe the aim of this paper, take you very, very quickly through just sort of what the agrarian question is and how I'm interpreting it for this work, and then look sort of, again, very quickly at a couple of the important agrarian class analyses that exist with respect to the Indian economy and how I'm sort of building on it, and then take you through sort of the location, the methodology, give you a general overview of the village, and then look specifically at the forces and relations of production and the role of diversification in this entire sort of milieu, and end with some kind of a conclusion. So very broadly, the aim of this paper is, I mean, it's a good old-fashioned fieldwork-based agrarian class analysis. It's a study in agrarian change. So, I mean, the primary aim is to look at the social relations of production and reproduction in agriculture, but while seriously trying to account for the linkages that agricultural households have with non-agricultural economic activities, or what I'm calling diversification. Diversification can also be understood in other ways, I mean, but the way that I'm using this term is how agricultural households are engaging in non-agricultural economic activities and how that impacts the agrarian class structure. And with that, I'm also trying to look at the role that caste plays in this entire process. And so this is a study based on fieldwork. The fieldwork is, I conducted the fieldwork in a village. The name of the village I've changed, I'm calling it Sangli, in district Rewari in southern Haryana. And the broad framing that I'm using is of the contemporary agrarian question of capital and labor. So what is this, the contemporary agrarian question? I mean, agrarian question has, we know, a long and sort of rich literature behind it, starting from sort of Engels's peasant question to the question of social relations of production, the kind that were asked by Lenin and Kautsky, then it becomes sort of the question of the role of agrarian surplus in Soviet industrialization, the Preobrazhensky-Bukharin sort of rendition of the agrarian question, which is then generalized in some ways, made broader by T.J. Byers, where it becomes the classic agrarian question, which is the role of agrarian surplus in industrialization more broadly, capitalist industrialization more broadly. And of course, that in turn has been sort of critiqued by Henry Bernstein, who basically contends that that kind of classic agrarian question is not relevant anymore, particularly in the era of neoliberal sort of globalization. For various reasons. I mean, there is actually a multiplicity of reasons why that is, why he makes that claim. But essentially what Bernstein says is that we have to, the agrarian question as it stands today is basically, it should focus on the reconstitution of agrarian classes. One, because of the impact of sort of the concentration of globalized capital at various sort of ends of the agricultural production and circulation circuit. And secondly, also because agrarian classes themselves are increasingly, as I said, have increasing linkages with non-agricultural activities, and those have to also be seriously accounted for. And so that's essentially what I'm trying to look at when I'm looking at the contemporary agrarian question. And I mean, there are several sort of important sort of sets of studies which have developed agrarian class analyses, contemporary studies, not necessarily to do with the mode of production debates, but contemporary studies. And of course, FAS is a significant chunk of those studies. And I'm going to just briefly sort of describe FAS criteria and class analysis and the kind of criteria and class analysis that is that I found in the works of Pattenden. So FAS, and again, at the risk of sort of a generalization, because we know that the class analysis actually differs from village to village, but if we had to take a sort of macro, not a macro, but just like a generalized picture, the main criteria would be sort of the ownership of means of production, level of and composition of incomes, and labor deployment on farm and non-farm activities. And the broad class analysis that would come out of this would be landlords and big capitalist farmers, basically who do not engage in manual labor on their fields, only in management labor. You have agricultural workers who get the bulk of their incomes from wage work. And in between these two classes, you have a differentiated peasantry. And of course, this class structure will look different in different villages. So this is sort of one set of agrarian class analyses. And then Jonathan Pattenden's work, which also builds on or draws on the work of Bernstein and Jens Lerka, and also Patnaik, Utsa Patnaik and Venkatesh Atreya. He uses the broad criteria of E ratio and surplus versus deficit production. And the broad class structure that he develops is dominant classes who are essentially surplus producers who rely primarily on hired labor. Classes of labor, which is this really sort of heterogeneous group of landless laborers, but also petty commodity producers who also do some wage work, and petty commodity producers, both agricultural and non-agricultural, who do some wage work, and groups of essentially different segments of different classes that are primarily selling labor power and are also deficit producers. And between this, there is this tiny category of petty commodity producers who do not hire or sell labor, which is really considered to be, I mean, numerically sort of not very significant in his characterization. And so drawing on these sort of sets of works, the criteria that I have settled on for my study are the E ratio, the exploitation ratio developed by Utsa Patnaik, specifically only within agriculture. I'm not looking at non-agricultural labor hiring in and out when I'm talking about the E ratio. I'm also looking at the level of and composition of incomes. I'm looking at the nature of diversification, and I'm looking at practices of reinvestment and sort of the scale of production within agriculture. So these are the sort of broad criteria that I am working with in this paper. Right, so the location, as I said, Sangli, obviously I've changed the name of the village, but it's in district Rewari, which is this district in Haryana. This is an interesting location for two main reasons. First, Haryana, we know is, I mean, it's frequently touted as sort of one of the Green Revolution success stories, right? One of the early adopters of Green Revolution techniques. And Rewari is interesting in this sense because while Green Revolution techniques were adopted early on, this is not, this area is not as sort of fertile as the northern part of Haryana, which is really the core Green Revolution area. So this southern part of Haryana, neighboring Rajasthan, it's quite dry and arid, which makes it interesting to see, you know, so it's an area where Green Revolution techniques have been adopted, but it's not the, it wasn't one of the originally targeted areas necessarily. So that's one interesting part about this location. The second is that it's quite close to Delhi, and along this area is basically an industrial belt that runs along National Highway 8, which has a number of industrial model townships like Manesar, like Bawal, like Nimrana, where a lot of international capital has congregated, particularly in the last 30 years. So it's an interesting place to study also the pull of urban and industrial employment potentially. So to see how the agrarian class structure sort of responds to this pull factor. In terms of the methodology, I did fieldwork in June, July 2019. I conducted 75 structured interviews with agricultural households, and by agricultural households, I mean households that are currently residing in the village and get some part of their income from either from land in some way. It can be through agricultural laboring, it can be through rents, and it can be through cultivation. So I'm not treating agricultural households as those which get the bulk of their income from agriculture. So in this sense, it's a broader category. And also in terms of methodology, I use the snowball method. So that means I did not do a census of the village. I went in through some contacts that I had, and then sort of the respondents, sometimes they would be recommended to me, sometimes I would find them on my own. And I supplemented the structured interviews with sort of group discussions that I had with farmers groups, with you know, laboring communities, with elders from various castes, and I also interviewed some government officials that I could find, like the Anganwadi workers or the Sarpanch or the village Nambardar. But through these interviews with the government officials, I did get information on sort of the population of the village and the caste composition. And so once I had that, I went back and tried to make my sample as representative as possible. So just to give you a general overview of the village, in 2019, the village had 506 households. My sample 75 is about 15% of the population. The average land holding in my sample was 5.7 acres, but the bulk of landowners were own less than 5 acres of land. And the largest land holding was only 22.5 acres. So the average land size is not that big. The main crops, the kharif crops, are primarily bajra, but also cotton, guar or cluster bean, and also genda or marigold flower. And the main rabi crops are wheat and mustard. And this is the sort of broad caste breakdown of the village and of my sample. So an interesting thing about this village is that land ownership is almost entirely concentrated with Savarnas. And I'm using the term Savarnas here because OBCs, particularly Ahirs, but also Khati and Prajapat households, but particularly Ahir households, are both numerically dominant and also are a significant landholding group in this village. So basically what I observed is that Avarna households, the scheduled caste households, had almost no land ownership. There was very little. And they were also almost entirely the agricultural laboring community, in the sense that agricultural labor hiring out was done almost entirely by Avarna households locally. Savarna landowners do not hire out agricultural labor in this village, at least. If they are landowners, then they don't hire out labor. They don't work on other people's fields. And so this sort of looking at this breakdown of land ownership and of how laboring practices happen, the main categories that I'm using are Savarna landowners and Avarna laborers within the village. I mean, there's other sets of laborers as well, which I'll come to in a bit. But those are the main categories that I'm using. And I mean, this is just a representation of the fact that Avarnas are primarily landless, and you see that a large chunk of Ahirs, as I said, are numerically dominant and also constitute a large part of the landowners. And you see that the bulk of holdings are actually sort of less than 5 acres. Right. So with that, let me come to the forces of production, so to speak. So the bulk of land in agriculture is inherited and also or leased in. But I mean, pure tenants were rare, in the sense that cultivators who are operating entirely on leased in land, that was extremely rare. Almost all cultivators would have at least some part of the land that they inherited, and they could augment that. They would augment that by leasing in, or sometimes by leasing. They would lease out land as well. The scale of leasing was small, though. So so 26 out of 47 landowners were leasing in land, but only 8 out of these 26 were leasing in more than 5 acres. So the scale of leasing was low. Looking at sort of the inputs, cultivators are buying seeds, high-yielding varieties of seeds from the market. They're buying fertilizers such as DAP, urea, zinc, potash, calcium, etc. They're also buying the pesticides. I'm sorry. The primary mode of irrigation is groundwater irrigation. So they use electrified pump sets. There is almost no canal irrigation in the village. And electrification sort of happened in the 1970s, the late 1970s, and that's when green revolution techniques were really adopted in this particular village after electrification. And there is a market for buying water or buying access to tube wells as well, but and about 1/4 of my of cultivators in my sample are renting in tube wells as well. But primarily, I mean, access to having a tube well is extremely important, and this is also critical because this village is in a block that is considered now. I mean, the groundwater levels have dropped quite dramatically, and no more new tube wells can be put in. So having a existing tube well is extremely important if you want to cultivate. Apart from that, also important to note that significant chunks of the cultivation process, such as land preparation, sowing for a number of crops, harvesting, particularly for wheat, and also threshing, these are almost entirely mechanized. Tractors and threshers are primarily used, and only for wheat you have the harvesting machine separately. And even though, I mean, 15 out of 47 landowners in my sample owned these tractors and threshers, but there is a very active rental market for these machines, which means that the use of machinery is fairly generalized across the village. Another quick note I will add on exchange on sale of the crops. We know that Haryana government procurement is fairly well functioning. I mean, particularly compared to other states. And in my sample, about 40% of the cultivators were selling their crops to both in the government mandis and also to private traders locally. Very few, actually only about 15% were selling only to government mandis, and that has something to do with the fact that you have to actually register how much you want to sell based on the number of acres that you own. So this can be a little bit of an issue for cultivators who are operating on leased-in lands. So if you're leasing in, then you are more likely to sell to private traders locally. And on average, something like 70% of the total crop product was sold, and about 30% is retained. There is also an active market for byproducts, and I mean, that is also actively, sold within the village as well. Right, now looking at the labor process, there's three main types of labor that's employed in cultivation. The first is local Avarna labor. So as I said, locally, only Avarna households actually perform agricultural labor on other sort of people's fields. I mean, the Jajmani system itself receded in about the 70s and 80s, but the kind of division of labor remains. And Avarna labor work on daily wage and piece-rated contracts. Avarna men prefer daily wage contracts, but that's also the smallest part of the labor costs that I observed. So daily wage contracts, cultivators don't prefer. They consider it to be expensive, and it requires sort of large supervision costs or whatever. So daily wage costs only accounted for 8.5% of the total labor costs in my sample of 47 landowners. Piece-rated contracts are preferred by the Savarna landowners, and these piece-rated contracts can also be either in cash or in kind. And for piece-rated, entire Avarna families may also work together, or groups of Avarna women would often do this work together. But apart from the local Avarna labor, migrant labor is a significant part of the entire labor process. And so groups of seasonal migrant labor come in primarily from Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, some also from Bihar. And migrant laborers are very strongly preferred by the cultivators, by the landowners, because they obviously work in large groups. They work exclusively on piece rates and on cash contracts, cash-based piece-rated contracts. And because they work in large groups and because it's piece-rated, they are much quicker at harvesting a stretch of land and things like that. So cultivators prefer migrant labor if they can find them. But apart from the labor hiring, unpaid family labor also continues to play an important role in cultivation. And in fact, so I look at the relative dependence on family labor versus hired labor through the E ratio. The E ratio, the exploitation ratio, as developed by Utsa Patnaik, was originally a measure of how much you're exploited relative to, scratch that. It was originally measured in labor days, and it was it gave you an estimate of how much net labor you are hiring in relative to unpaid family labor that's performed on the field. I am unable to use that original measure because I don't have first-hand data on the number of labor days that were worked in piece-rated contracts. I have data on the daily wage days that are hired in, but I don't have data on the number of days of piece-rated work. So I use a monetary variant of the E ratio. And essentially what this is the total labor hiring costs minus the income from agricultural labor of a household divided by family labor days. Now this data I could gather, multiplied by the going daily wage rate in the village at that time, which was 400 rupees. So basically the numerator gives me the net labor costs, net cost of labor hiring in, and the denominator gives me the imputed costs of family labor. Now, because landowning households don't hire out as manual laborers, this term is basically zero. So the E ratio is essentially the, yes.
I'm sorry to interject, but just to remind you that you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. The E ratio is basically giving me the total labor costs divided by the imputed costs of family labor. And what I observe is that very few households are dependent entirely on family labor and very few are dependent entirely on hired labor. Most are using a combination, and about 50% are actually primarily reliant on family labor and 50% are primarily reliant on hired labor. I'm going to skip this slide because it's not extremely important and move now to the diversification strategies that are actually observed first among landowners and then among the Avarna landowners. So in terms of diversification strategies, I first divide households into primarily agricultural and diversified. Primarily agricultural are households for whom agriculture is the largest source of household income. And the first thing that I observe is that most households, 70%, earn the majority of their income from non-agricultural sources. And if you are primarily agricultural, then your per capita income is about half on average that of diversified households. It's also evident that marginal and small landowners are more likely to be diversified. And the main types of diversification that I observe, particularly among landowners, is wage work and sort of merchant and commercial capital or petty businesses. So looking at businesses first, so obviously surpluses from agriculture are used to set up businesses, and these businesses can be sort of, local kirana shops locally, or it can be grain trading sort of business. It can be setting up a mobile shop in Manesar. It can be having a dairy-based production of, sweets. So there is a small factory and there is also a shop within the village. These are some of the kinds of businesses that some of the Savarna landowners were engaged in. Households that were primarily diversified in business were very likely to withdraw from physical labor on the field. So they would either hire long-term farm servants, or they would sort of just lease out all the land altogether. They're also the most well-off in the village. They had the highest average per capita incomes. The bulk of diversification is in wage work, but specifically within wage work, service is the term that a lot of respondents use as, the kind of job that they want. So by service, they mean, either a government job, so a stable government job, or a stable formal long-term job in the private sector. And so 29% of the diversification by Savarna landowners was actually in government jobs, which is fairly high. A lot of this was in the army, and I mean there is a long history of particularly Ahirs enrolling in the army. So that's where a lot of this is rooted in, but it's also, you know, in the electricity board or in the police, etc. So that is 29% of the diversification, which is again fairly, you know, a huge chunk. And then there is also about 19%, which is private formal employment. And what enables this, so landowners are able to find formal jobs both in the public and in the private sector. I mean, some part of it has to do with caste networks and sort of, you know, knowing how to apply for these jobs and things like that. But it also has to do with the fact that Savarna landowners invest quite heavily in education, private schooling, and then also in, you know, they send their children to nearby towns and cities for to do an undergraduate and a graduate degree. 72% of the Savarna landowners in my sample had at least one member with a graduate degree. So 34 out of 47 basically had at least one graduate, and 24 out of 47 had more than one graduate. Just a small interesting note. The education levels were fairly high for both men and women in Savarna households, but the wage work outside the house was only done by men. There were only 3 women in the 47 households that I interviewed, only 3 women who were doing a job outside the house. All of the rest of diversification was only men in Savarna households. And looking at the relationship of this diversification with reinvestment in agriculture, one thing that became very, very clear is that once you have diversified, you are not as likely to reinvest in agriculture. You are not likely to buy tractors or produce on an expanded scale. Primarily agricultural households are actually twice as likely to invest. And even within primarily agricultural households, if you have a larger land holding, or if you have a small diversification, which is basically supplementing your investable surplus, you're much more likely to buy tractors or threshers, and you're also more likely to lease in land and produce on an expanded scale. Once you are diversified in wage work, for example, you are much more likely to lease out land. You will continue to use family labor on the field, but it requires some division of labor within the household. You know, some members are commuting, particularly during harvest season, back to the village to help out with this labor, and then they go back to the city where they're doing their job, etc. But so essentially what I observe is that agricultural surpluses enable diversification, both business and through education into formal employment. But once you are diversified, you're not as likely to put money back into agriculture. For Avarna landless households, they are much more likely to be diversified, and that's simply because there is not as much opportunity to work as agricultural laborers within the village, because cultivators do prefer migrant workers, etc. And also because the level of income from agricultural laboring is so low that you have to supplement it with other sources of income. And but the main types of diversification that I observed among the Avarna landless were almost entirely informal, almost entirely contractual, or I mean predominantly daily wage work. So only 16.2% of the diversification was in regular salaried employment, of which only 5% was formal. So I mean formally protected by a long-term contract. Yeah.
Sorry to bother. Like we're into the last 5 minutes. So try to wrap it up.
Right. And obviously, a lot of this has to do with the fact that Avarna landless households don't have the kind of caste networks that Savarna landowners do. But it's also, I mean, made worse by the fact that because of their lower levels of income, they cannot invest in private education as much. So only about 18% of the Avarna landless households opted, I mean, opted is the wrong term, but opted for private schools, and only 11% had one graduate or more in the household. And even the types of self-employment that I observed were obviously very different from the kinds of self-employment that were observed among Savarna landowners. So among the Avarna, it would be like being a street hawker over the weekends, or a lot of women worked as seamstresses part-time. You could have a bicycle repair shop, etc. So just like very, very small levels of capital. And so based on all of this, this is the class analysis that I actually come up with at the end, where the village elites, so to speak, are households that are diversified into businesses who have, as I said, the largest annual per capita incomes, and households that are diversified in formal employment. Then come the primarily agricultural households who do have investable surpluses, followed by primarily agricultural households who don't have investable surplus or who are diversified into informal types of employment. And at the bottom of the hierarchy are landless laborers who have the lowest average per capita incomes as well. So to conclude, the broad story that emerges from this is that, as I said, agricultural surpluses do enable diversification in business and formal employment. So land ownership basically plays a critical role in shaping these pathways. Caste identity also plays an important role, particularly caste networks and sort of generational patterns of enrollment into particular kinds of jobs play a critical role. Not as common to observe reinvestment into agriculture once a household is diversified. Cash surpluses in agriculture, this is something I couldn't go into in the presentation, but cash surpluses depend quite strongly on unpaid family labor. And this is also one of the reasons why landowners are dissatisfied with agriculture and they want to get a service job. But land ownership does serve also as a fallback against casual labor, even if you're not able to find that formal job. So you are prevented from doing daily wage work in agriculture or in construction if you own land in this village, at least. I'm not saying this is a generalized trend across India, but in this village, that's what I observed. Avarna landless households, obviously, they lack the social capital or the investable surpluses that come in from cultivation and are instead confined to casual daily wage labor in the informal economy. So this strong association between caste and land ownership and how these shape diversification pathways, this is understood as conjugated oppression, which is basically this concept of Jens Lerche and Alpa Shah, which basically is the co-constitution of class and caste identities in the contemporary capitalist, so neoliberal capitalist economy. Yeah, okay, that's where I'll end. I apologize for going over time a little bit. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Srishti. I apologize for not keeping your time. And since time is at a premium, let us go immediately to Dr. Paramjit Singh, professor from Panjab University, to give his comments, his discussant's comments. Over to you. And can we think in terms of 5-10 minutes?
Yes, 5-7 minutes, not more than that. Thank you, Professor White. Thank you, Srishti, for this wonderful presentation. So I read your paper also. In that paper, I have found there are many interesting findings. So there are a couple of important aspects that Srishti has covered in paper as well as in this presentation. One is that she tried to revise the importance of class analysis. That class analysis is important if you really want to understand the agrarian relations. So along with class, one other thing that she has incorporated is caste. So how you integrate class and caste to understand the agrarian question in global south, this is one, which is very important in her presentation. Second thing which is important in her presentation was that this contribution is important from the perspective that because since last 2 decades or so, the discussion or the gravity of discussion on agrarian question has shifted from class analysis to the integration of agriculture sector of global south into the accumulation logic of global capitalism. So in that context, somewhere the class analysis has lost its importance. So that is why this work is significant. that Srishti has tried to look into the class aspects of agrarian relations. Moreover, Srishti has highlighted one very important point, that is to redefine the agrarian question in the light of changing livelihood and accumulation strategies of rural households. So that is also very important. So specific to her study, the significance lies in the fact that Haryana is a part of India's early green revolution zone, but southern part of Haryana was not effectively explored or examined by the agrarian Marxists. So study area is significant in that context, particularly the southern part. So that is a part of Srishti's study. The other thing which is important, that just the sample size and technique of sampling. So that can be debated, because FAS always says that the census survey is more comprehensive, and through census survey you can actually bring the real picture of the agrarian relations in a particular region. So that is a debatable issue as far as sample size of Srishti is concerned. The other thing which is very important about this presentation, that Srishti has brought two very important aspects about production and reproduction in the study region. One is that she highlighted the changing nature of tenancy, that which reflects the demise of pure tenants. So that is very important, right? So tenancy now, for pure tenants, it's not possible to continue in agriculture. It may be due to the mechanization of production operations. It may be due to the increase in cost of cultivation or decline in profitability in agriculture. Right? So this is one very important aspect that she highlighted about the study region. Second aspect is about methodology. So although she has used Patnaik's E-index, but she also highlighted the importance of machinery to understand the agrarian class structure. So I think this is very important for us to incorporate the role of mechanization into the E-index of Patnaik while we are differentiating the agrarian classes, because mechanization is very important in this particular zone of India, the mechanization of agrarian operations. Then the next is that the analysis of diversification of agricultural households is important from many respects that Srishti has highlighted. One is it gives insights that agriculture is no more a sole occupation for majority of rural households. Along with agriculture, they are involved in many non-agricultural activities. So, however, the nature and type of activities are associated with caste, class, and their resource position. So as she highlighted, in case of Swarna households, so majority of them are either in public sector jobs, private jobs, or they are self-employed in business. Some of them may be involved in petty commodity production activities. But if you go to Avarna households, then the picture is totally different. The Avarna landless households are not dependent upon agriculture for the livelihood. So this is very important. Earlier, prior to the mechanization, they were dependent, but after the introduction of new liberalism or the industrialization of that particular region, the development of industries or the flow of global capital to that particular region, which is a subject matter of her study, has shifted the livelihood structure of landless households. So they are no more dependent upon the big landlords to get the wages or to get the livelihood. So this is a very important point. Then, however, in non-agriculture also, it doesn't mean that they are doing a very good jobs. As she highlighted, they are largely involved in informal jobs, particularly the Avarna households, right? So in overall, Srishti has successfully highlighted the complexity of agrarian class relations by integrating it with caste hierarchy in rural Haryana. So that is very important. This study overlaps between caste and class is very important to understand the agrarian relations not only in Haryana but in India. And this needs more research on same lines if we really want to further go deep into it. This is an important area, right? So thank you very much for time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paramjit. We have about a quarter of an hour. It now falls to me to also add to discussants' comments and perhaps suggest questions. And I'm very aware that there are interesting questions piling up in the chat box, which we really need to pay attention to. So of many questions which I could have asked, time is a constraint. The first question I'd like to ask you is, what is agriculture and what is diversification? Because we're to some extent at the mercy of official classifications. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that you yourself point to diversification within agriculture, both in crops and in the labor process. And you also allude in passing to something which I think we tend to forget, which is livestock, which then turns our attention to women's work and women's work within the family. And you also mentioned rental markets. So is tractor renting agriculture, or is it the non-farm economy? I think you could argue it both ways. So can you tell us more about how you define the boundaries for your question? Then I have a picky question about the E ratio. I don't understand how you have combined total costs and total minus total returns from agricultural labor over family labor. It's family labor days times an imputed wage rate which comes from daily wage labor, whereas you have told us, and we know from literature, that the logic of family labor is not like that. In fact, you talk about it as unpaid. So I have a problem with that 400 rupees at the bottom of the formula. And I also have a more general problem, which is that you've done a really neat job in of making sense of a contested and very wide literature on the agrarian question. But then you decide that you're going to use 4 or 5 categories: Patnaik, monetized version of Patnaik, income, diversification, and scale, which we don't hear a lot about in your paper, so that you've already got a very complex indicator of class. And when it comes to caste, in fact, having discussed it quite in again, a very neat and detailed way, and discussed these contentious concepts like conjugated oppression and what do we have? We have intersectionality, and we have Ambedkar's graded inequality. We have a lot of concepts trying to cater for the complexity of caste. You then actually tell the story simply in terms of Savarna, Avarna. Yeah. So what you've done is present the complexity, and then in order to make it tractable, you reverted to something that you didn't actually review as a class characteristic, but having reviewed the complexity of caste, you come back to a binary for your study of diversification. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying that that's a product of the difficulty that this area poses for making sense in terms of classes. And I suppose the final point, I've got lots of questions, but the final point now is that for most people studying agrarian society, class is a category. And the reason for that is that class is treated as a category officially for policy, in censuses, etc., etc. But caste is actually a relation, just like caste. And the Avarna castes are dominated by the Savarna castes, and we get little sense of how it works in your village. We know from lots of literature that low caste people live differently, they're not allowed into houses, they work in a way which is dirty and involves a lot of physical effort, they work in toxic environments, they may be ritually or physically tainted, they are regarded as idiots and even not as humans in some extreme cases. They may be untouchable, literally, they may suffer humiliation, exclusion from access to government, exclusion from access to public goods, all of that. And I wondered, given the literature, which is quite voluminous, which talks about caste as a relation, how one can actually integrate caste in the way that you're trying to do into the classifications of the agrarian question. And also integrate a study of the relations of caste that lead to these different patterns of diversification, which you've described. Now, I've got many more, but I shall stop there. I don't know whether you'd like a first response, or would you like to go on to some of the questions in the chat box and collect all the questions and perhaps sum up at the end? What would you like, Srishti?
Could I maybe just very briefly respond to some of these because these are
Okay.
quite important, and then
We'll go to the chat box.
So just your question of what is agriculture and what is diversification, extremely important. I suppose my motivation for the study was to see what is happening out, not just within cultivation, but also just like broadly from owning land and working on land, which is why rental incomes, both from land and from machinery, are, you know, part of this analysis. But husbandry is not, because it was just too complicated, because it's so difficult to quantify. And that was the reason that I did not include it into where it should have been. Ideally, I would have liked to have a unified analysis of cultivation and husbandry on one side, and then also look at the various sources of income that emerge from land ownership and from ownership of machinery. So that was the broad idea that I was operating with. And that's essentially how I drew the boundaries. I won't, so in terms of the E ratio and imputing costs, you are absolutely right. That was the big challenge, is do Savarna landowners actually value their time at the dihadi rate? Or is that the logic with which they operate? And I did not have an easy answer to that. What's interesting is that in a few of the responses, when I asked them the question of, are you satisfied with agriculture? A few of the responses were, apni dihadi bhi nahi niklegi. Agar, like if they were to try to calculate whatever net surplus is left after, you know, reducing the cost, if they were to try to impute daily wage costs on the number of family labor days employed, that's what they said in some of the responses, then that would also not be covered. So that it felt like there is still some rooting with that concept. It may not, because they do fundamentally view it as work that they will not do. That's another thing that came out from the responses, is that agricultural laboring on other people's fields is something you do not do. That is something to be avoided on all costs. Even if you have to keep cultivating your 0.25 acres of land, you will continue to do that, but you will not work on other people's fields. So that is definitely a fracture that I don't fully know how to deal with, which also ties in with the complexity of caste. And the binary of Avarna and Savarna that I'm using is mainly because of the fact that it seemed to me that, and this may not be very academic to say, but it seemed to me that there was a lot more of viewing of a Rajput household and a Banya household viewing themselves to be on the same-ish plane as an Ahir household, but they would never view themselves as to be on the same plane. Even a landless Brahmin household would never view themselves to be on the same plane as a landless Chamar household or a landless Dhanak household. That is sort of where, and obviously the pattern of land ownership is contributing to this, and the fact that even when Avarna households do end up getting some land through sort of, you know, government is allotting them land, almost always they don't have access to water, which means that they actually cannot cultivate. So even that land ownership is only in name to some extent. So, I mean, those are again some of the things that were informing my choosing of this Savarna Avarna polarization. It's also informed by the work of Teltumde, I will say, Anand Teltumde's work. But yeah, I think that this is the big question that one has to deal with in future work.
Professor.
Thank you very much. I've had a good look at the mounting number of questions in the chat box. Srishti, can you read them? Can you see them in the chat box? There are some about method and technique. There are some about context. There are some about broadly labor, and there are some about class and accumulation. And I would like to start simply by flagging. Prachi has asked about selection bias in a snowball sampling, and I would have made the same point. It's very common now not to census a population and then take a representative or random sample, but to do as you've done. It's now very common and it's accepted in development studies. But what do we do with that data when we don't know the population. So the danger is, and I think you've done this, is to extrapolate and make generalizations, whereas a snowball sample is really good for processes. I wonder what you feel about your own method. And Sumit Arora asked again a question about the E ratio, which I would have to find and read out. Sumit, where is it? Sunit. Quick question about methodology. Okay. Oh, I'm going to.
I can see so many.
While calculating E ratios, how did you account? And I can't read it. How did you? It keeps jumping. Sorry.
Shall I read it for you, Professor?
Please, please.
Yeah, he has 2 quick questions. While calculating E ratios, how did you account for the supervisory work in agriculture, especially by the landlords? Was non-farm labor also taken into consideration while calculating E ratios? So one thing I want to say, if everybody is okay with it, I think we are running out of time. We'll take 10 more minutes to address the questions that are in the chat box. I hope that is all right for everybody.
And anybody who has to leave, please leave.
Thank you.
Okay, so the 2 questions about method, should we take them first?
So the question about snowball and potential bias in the sample, completely legitimate. If I had the resources, I would have done a census, but I did not. I was alone on the field, basically, no research team. So, which is why I had to choose this method, and that's the only reason. I fully recognize that it's there is a large potential for bias. What I did try to do, as I mentioned, is that once I had figures on the broad caste composition of the village and also the patterns of land ownership among each caste, I tried to sort of actively find respondents so that my sample would represent what I knew about the village population. But I know that that is just some, a stopgap fix. It's not, so definitely a concern. In terms of calculating E ratio, non-farm labor was not accounted for in this. So this is looking only at farming. This is not even looking at the labor that goes into husbandry, only the labor that goes in process of cultivation. And in terms of supervisory work, no, that is actually not included in this. I only asked them, I asked the Savarna respondents the number of days that they themselves spent working on or working with hired laborers or individually. So this does not separately account for supervisory work.
So I think what this may do is trigger some qualifying, and I'm sure you've done this in your thesis, some qualifying reflections about the method. The next bundle of questions, actually, the foundation is sending me questions classified in a different way, but and thank you very much for that. But the next bundle is a set of questions about labour. Nil Alt-Kechik has asked about migrant labour and how they enter your analysis. It seems quite a black box. And Mihika Chatterjee asked, sort of labour related, that pure tenancy, she took you up on this pure tenancy and asks about impure tenancy from the lesser landowning classes. What does it look like? And what are the implications? Could you have a go at those?
Okay. The migrant labor, yes, labor contractors do play a role. Typically, the migrant workers would come and stay on the tube well of the contractor, basically. That's the main source of water, etc. But I am actually not sure how exactly labor contractors shaped their hiring, because the way that the landowners responded was that they themselves would go out and try to find migrant workers and bring them to the field. That seemed to be their approach, both with the local Avarna labor and with the migrant labor. So I'm actually, and also because I didn't directly interview the migrant laborers myself, I don't know if a share of the income was going to the contractor, etc. In terms of tenancy, so as I said, about the exact number of households who had leased in land is actually fairly high, but most of it is leasing 2, 3, 4 acres. What emerged was that leasing is really constrained by how much family labor you have to spare. So the scale at which you can operate is really, to some extent, a function of, because labor hiring is expensive. So you want to be mindful of how much of your family labor is deployed in other activities, and therefore essentially how much family labor is available to take on this additional cultivation work, which is also why diversified households are more likely to lease out. They want to cultivate at that, that sweet spot of where they can use as much family labor as possible while still hiring for some operations, which are convenient, and sort of have as much cash surplus as possible at the end of this process.
Thank you. There are a slew of questions which are asking you more about production conditions, and I guess as a kind of framing for accumulation and diversification. Rakesh is asking, are yields and inputs and mechanization class specific? Kranti is asking about what are the drivers of reinvestment in agriculture itself. And Judith has asked about the context outside the village in which the non-farm economy is playing. How about those three?
Yes. So Rakesh's question, level of yield. Yield is one place where I did not observe huge variations. Input use and mechanization, some of the input use, how much fertilizer you're using, it was not entirely motivated by cost concerns. Some cultivators were actively choosing to use less fertilizers because they could visibly see that the soil composition is changing, and crops that they were growing previously like chana and guar are just not working anymore because the soil is just changed so much. So fertilizer use in that sense, not, everyone's using a basic level of DAP and urea, on which some are adding, calcium and potash and things like that, and others are consciously choosing to stay away from that. Mechanization, yes, smaller landowners are much less likely, larger landowners are more likely, but even within that, then diversification actually ends up playing a role, because if you are diversified, you're less likely to invest in machines. So if you're primarily agricultural, you're actually most likely to both lease inland, produce on scale, have larger input use, and also buy machines and threshers yourself, possibly also rent them out to others, serves as an additional source of income, and use it on your own fields. A second set of questions.
Judith was about context. Judith was asking about the wider context within which people have opportunities to diversify into the rural and not so rural non-farm economy. Could you tell us more about the context?
I'm maybe not able to parse the question correctly.
Shall I read it for you, Srishti?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Professor Judith says it's very good to see a serious attempt to integrate non-agricultural with the agricultural economy. Can you tell us more about the context, the local economy in which people work outside the villages?
Outside the villages, so as I said, in this belt, a lot of labor actually goes to the industrial model townships and sort of engages in either weekly or sort of monthly migration patterns. There is also, because enrollment in the army, etc., plays a critical role, there is also like a fair amount of annual migration that happens. One thing I do have to note is that, of course, there are large numbers of households within this village who have moved out entirely And so their houses would just be locked, right? There would be no one in those houses, and they have potentially just moved out and are living in either nearby cities like Manesar or in bigger cities, and engaged in different types of work. The local Rewari city is the nearest big city where also some people go to work, but that did not come out to be the main place where a lot of people work. So, for example, Avarna landless are likely to go to Rewari to work at a small shop as a helper or something like that. Whereas Savarna landowners would more likely to be sort of going to Delhi or, for their job, for their naukri. But apart from that, the broader context, I mean, so there is a lot of industrial employment. Is that the sense in which this question is being asked?
Judith, you're muted.
Rosa, you're muted.
I was just thinking that this is an extremely interesting paper for me, particularly in its attempt to integrate the agricultural and the non-agricultural analysis. I mean, the analysis of rural classes, the analysis of rural economy, in which you've got agriculture fairly prominently, but you are actually trying to integrate the non-agricultural side of the story as well. And that's very unusual. And what I wanted to know was, I mean, if you're going to do that, where are these villages situated in the wider economy? Because that's what distinguishes villages in different parts of India in terms of what they're able to, how they integrate into the local economy, what they're able to do with agriculture, how agriculture interacts with the rest of the economy. So I just wanted more of a sense of what these villages, how they are located with respect to alternative possible enterprises and alternative possible employment.
Right. So just maybe I'll add to my answer. It did seem from the responses that there isn't a huge market for selling to mills, etc. in this area. So whatever is being sold to private traders is basically going, I mean, it's wheat that's going to be sold in Kirana shops ultimately, type of, so that's sort of the place of agriculture in the regional economy, is that this is not like Western UP, essentially, is what I'm saying. And the main pull factor is from the sort of city jobs in Delhi and the kind of industrial jobs and jobs that are, or self-employment that is catering to the working class in this industrial belt. So setting up a mobile phone shop in Manesar that's aimed at the industrial workers who are living in that area, or setting up a Kirana shop in Manesar itself for the workers who are in that area. So yeah,
I think that could go on for hours and hours, and I would like to finish with two more questions from the chat. Very, very good ones. I'm sorry to cut you off, but time is at a premium. Bhupendra makes the point that in your attempt to integrate caste into the agrarian class question, what is the value of the idea of castes of labor? Castes of labor, and you did tabulate jatis, but you then went back to Savarna Avarna. And I think he's picking up on that. And then the final question is the first one that the FAS team have sent to me, which is Shreya's question, Shreya Sinha, which is presumably we do this in order for a modified and enriched agrarian question to be replicated and tested and applied elsewhere. And how on earth would you translate what you found about caste into a richer, I don't know what, that's the question, ethnicized or version of the agrarian question to look at, say, in Latin America or in Africa. So those are the questions we're going to end with.
I mean, to Shreya's question, I think that is the significance of the conjugated oppression theoretical sort of framing, is that and I believe that the authors themselves have done this, right? That they have used this concept to also look at race in America, not necessarily, but so the core idea is that even if you are selling your labor power, as you may be petty commodity producers in agriculture, if you are selling your labor power, the kinds of employment that are accessible to you are, that's not the same for everyone, and what you can access can depend very strongly on social, like historically what your position has been in the rural economy, in the agricultural economy. So here what I'm seeing is that caste, the sort of historically the advantages that caste has given to the caste identity has given to certain groups, those are being translated into primarily formal employment, formal public employment, and that seems to be the most preferred. It's also, you know, most secure, well-paying job, etc. So it's caste here. It can be different things in other places, but yeah, the idea is to look at what kind of jobs actually you can access. Fine, you are there is proletarianization, but what the kinds of jobs you can, or the pathways into the new economy, as they call it, those are shaped by the position you had historically as well. I mean, so I think that's, so obviously this particular framing is what I observed in this village, is that land ownership is so starkly different for these Savarna and Avarna groups, and which is actually why I'm using this land ownership is my base and not laboring, because Ahirs, Prajapats, Kumhars are also laboring castes, historically have been laboring castes, but particularly Ahirs were also beneficiaries of this kind of Jajmani system based, you know, Avarna labor, annual sort of, I don't know what exactly to call it, but these kind of servitude relations. So in this sense, laboring itself was not enough. And maybe this does not extend to the other OPC castes that are in the village. So yes, I do take that this is a problematic division. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, Srishti. We have run out of time. There's another question by Harmanenda in the chat, which is also about querying the E ratio. I don't want to ask it because we have run out of time, but thank you for asking that question, because it clusters around the other questions that have been raised for about that, the monetization of Wutsapatnaik's labor labor-based classification. Anyway, thank everybody who has asked piercing questions. Thank you, the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, for organizing it. In a month's time, let me see, we have Rhea Das from JNU talking about agrarian change in West Bengal. I'm sure that this conversation could go on for many hours, and you've really triggered a very important dimension of the agrarian question, which has been relatively neglected. So thank you all very much. And thank you also, Paramjit, for extremely succinct and stimulating comments. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
I'll finish with the vote of thanks if you, yeah. So thank you, Professor Barbara, for this wonderful session. I would like to extend my thanks to Srishti Yadav for an insightful presentation, and Dr. Paramjit Singh for his valuable comments and his participation. We're especially grateful to Professor Barbara Harris-White for chairing the session and agreeing to be the chair for all the upcoming sessions. I thank Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung South Asia for their continuous support in making this series possible. And thank all the attendees for participating and making this a very, very lively session. We at the foundation sincerely hope that you'll all be participating in the future sessions of the seminar series too. I'm also thankful to the online team at FAS, Sandeepan, Tapas, Deepak, Setu, Rakesh, and the Free Software Movement Karnataka's Gautam for their role in conducting this program very smoothly. Before closing the session, I would also like to inform you about the next seminar, which Professor Barbara has already mentioned. On the last Thursday of June, that is the 30th of June, Ms. Raya Das will be presenting her work on agrarian change in West Bengal. She has recently submitted her PhD at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and is currently a fellow at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. We will be posting more details about the event in coming weeks on our website, which is fas.org.in, and our social media handles. You can find us at FAS Agri Studies on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I request that you follow the website and social media handles to not only get updates about the seminar series, but also about the other work we do. A recording of the previous session that featured Juhi Chatterjee is available on YouTube. She spoke about energy use in agriculture and the potential for abatement of emissions. You can access that on our YouTube channel. This session too will be made available on YouTube in the near future. We will be ending this session with this. Thank you everybody for your participation. Have a great evening.